Good evening, families, friends, neighbors. I'm Murray Abellis. I'm the Chief of Administration and Finance for NYC Kids Rise, and I am the proud father of Eleanor and Madeline, a 9-year-old and 6-year-old here in Astoria. I want to thank you for attending tonight's Community Town Hall. It's the latest in the series of town halls from the Save for College program to provide resources to the families in our program. As many of you know, the NYC Kids Rise Save for College program is a way for all of us to come together, families, schools, neighbors, businesses, to provide and create a financial asset for the educational future of our students. I am exceptionally proud to say that the Save for College program now has over 10,000 families in the program across kindergarten, first grade, and second grade in District 30, all 39 schools. So that means every one of those students now has a financial asset for their future, regardless of immigration status and income. The Save for College program is all about bringing the neighborhood together so that not only that every child have a savings towards their educational future, but they're supported along the way. As many of you know, we're living in an extraordinarily challenging time in this city and nation's history. Not only are we living through a global pandemic and economic downturn that has impacted District 30 families exceptionally hard, we are now at a moment of recognition, right, in our country. Recognition that systemic and institutional racism and unequal treatment continues to impact Black and Brown communities and families. At a moment like this, communities must come together, not only for the adults, but primarily for our children, and how we come together and support talking about this to our children and realizing that a conversation needs to be had about racial justice and this moment in history. Before we get started, I would like to take a moment of silence for George Floyd and all of those we have lost. I cannot say this with more force. We stand in solidarity with the Black community and all those mourning the lives we've lost. We mourn with you and stand with you for the future of all of our children. Save for College program is in a community that is exceptionally diverse. It's probably the most diverse in the country. Each of us comes to this town hall tonight with our own backgrounds, our own lived experiences that we must honor. Whether you're a Black New Yorker, a Latinx New Yorker like my family, an Asian New Yorker, a new immigrant, a Queens, a lifelong Queens resident, we are all living and experiencing this in a very different and unique way. We're all together, but we must honor those differences. I myself am a proud product of District 30 public schools. I went to PS 69, IS 145, and later went to high school in Jamaica, Queens. And most proudly, I'm the father of 2 little girls going to school in Astoria. Like many of you out there, and as a parent trying to navigate this new world, I'm trying to figure out, and I'm thinking about age-appropriate conversations that I can have with my girls about this moment, to put it in context. As parents and guardians, we owe a responsibility to be an example and to try to figure out what activities we can do to help our children grow and cope. I'm exceptionally thrilled to have our panel here tonight, and these questions will be part of our conversation. I'd like to introduce them briefly to you. Ebony Young, a former executive director of the LIC YMCA, a mom, a community builder. She will share her perspective on coping strategies and resources and ways to uplift your children. Isu Matt, manager of diversity and inclusion for the U.S. Tennis Association, and a dad. He'll share his perspective as a parent on how to engage children and to keep them in mind. Kenneth Hamilton, third grade teacher and equity chair at Dalton, will bring his expertise as an educator and share what factors such as history and context are important for having these conversations with children. Karen Fleshman, founder of Racy Conversations, mom and activist. She works supporting white families with understanding racism and privilege, and will speak to how she addresses these topics as a mom with her children and the behaviors that need to be unlearned. And Matt de la Peña, New York Times bestselling author and Newbery Medal-winning author of children's books. He will share how books focused on race and identity can empower children, open their worlds, and enable them to guide the conversation. I also want to highlight an incredibly important partner, the NYC Department of Education. They have released a series of very helpful resources on the topics for families and school teams. We'll share those resources from tonight's conversation on the Facebook page after the event. And also wanted to highlight two members of the Queens North Borough Office, Melinda Willens and Ana Arrigo. They're watching the town hall tonight, and they're going to be sharing resources and responding to questions in the comments. We're super excited to have them here tonight. And most importantly, we're exceptionally thrilled to have your questions. Please post them through the conversation, and we will get to them and put them in so that our panelists can answer them if you have something top of mind. And finally, a very special way to end this tonight. We're going to have our panelist, Matt, do a reading of his book, Last Stop on Market Street. So at that point, I'll let you know so you can bring your children around and we can have a wonderful bedtime story. With that, let's start our conversation. Kenneth, racism protests, lost lives. You just have to look at the news and social media, and it is throughout. How do we start this conversation with kids of all different ages? And what do we focus on? Share some of the things you've had to tackle with your students.
Sure. Great. So good evening, everyone. My name is Kenneth, and I am a third grade teacher at the Dalton School, but I'm also the equity chair. And so I am responsible for DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion programming for all K through third grade. So we're really dealing with our youngest learners. But to your question, I think the most important thing is that we're being honest with the children. It would be in poor judgment if we were to think that they weren't being exposed, whether it's on the news, like you mentioned, through social media. They might be exposed to newspapers and advertisements. And so being honest with children and grounding the conversation in what they're saying. But I think it's important to also preface with the idea, the understanding that depending on how you identify will determine how you enter this conversation. And so I say that to say my classroom is comprised of students of color predominantly. So I have more students of color than I have white identified students. And so in that, I recognize that the way I approach the conversations around Black Lives Matter looks a certain way with Black identified students than it does with my Latinx community, my Asian identified folks, and so on. And that being said, what I really strive to do as a teacher is have a foundational shared understanding of what is going on. What is, when you boil it down, what is the issue? And so talking with my third graders and other grades in the lower school, the students wanted to know what is a protest and why is racism happening? And it's important to listen to what the children are saying. And I say that very clearly and specifically because oftentimes as adults, we project our own understanding onto what we think they're saying. And I often draw the parallel to when kids ask where babies come from. Like our youngest kids, when they're kindergartners, they're not asking the specifics, right? They just kind of want an idea of what's going on. And so it's that same understanding. What is the most important piece of information that they need? And how can I be honest with my understanding of the world and racism and injustice and communicate that to my children? Does that make sense for you?
Absolutely. I mean, as a parent, I think it's our imperative to listen to children, to actually hear their perspective and see where they're coming from so that we can address it directly. I'd like to hand this off to Isu as another parent. How have you handled talking about this moment's topics, and what has helped you navigate the difficult conversation?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for the question. Um, I got to tell you, your knee-jerk reaction a lot of times is to procrastinate, right, and try to push this conversation out as far as you possibly can. But I think Kenneth really underscored the point that if the information doesn't come from you, if the guidance, if the perspective doesn't come from you, then you have very little control over how they receive and process the information. So as much as your knee-jerk reaction might be to want to push the conversation, kick the can down the road a little bit, it requires a certain level of courage with you. I know for me, being the father of a 14-year-old and an 11-year-old, if I'm watching the news, they're watching the news, right? They're on social media platforms, whether it's TikTok or Instagram, or Snapchat, and so there's information that they're being exposed to when I'm around. There's information that they're being exposed to when I'm not around. And so first and foremost, and again, I think Kenneth kind of really underscored this point. When I did realize it's time, now it's time to have the conversation. It was really more about them and less about me. It was really more about what it is that they were thinking, saying, feeling, questioning, uh, and being exposed by virtue of working in sport, being exposed to children across the country, all different ages. One of the things I learned very early on is there's a way that you can talk to children and they'll open up and they'll share with you just about anything you want to know. And there's a way you can talk to children and they won't share anything with you. And that difference is judgment. So the other conversation I had to have internally with myself is that this better be the judgment free zone. And so as I started having the conversation with them, I mean, we all know this, right? But I'm learning from them as much as they're learning from me. Our conversation was so rich in the first 5 minutes that I asked them if they wouldn't mind taking the conversation on to Instagram Live, because I thought other parents would be listening to this and there'll be some nuggets that they can glean from the conversation. And other kids would be listening to this and could get some gems out of it as well. And so we did. We went on Instagram Live and had this two-way conversation for 49 minutes. And it was really, really fascinating and unbelievable. I couldn't have been prouder, as a father. I'm like, those are my kids. But in truth, it was all about them. It was coming from them. What I tried to do is give them perspective. The hardest part is to really answer the question for them: why is this happening, and how long has this been happening? That's the most difficult part of the conversation, because they want to know, well, why does this continue to happen? And we have to be honest enough to say sometimes, we don't even have all the answers. But you have to meet it with courage. I think you have to keep your own judgment out of the conversation and really let them really follow their inquisitiveness.
I commend you on the exceptional bravery that it takes to put that out there, right? It's hard enough to have the conversation, but then to put it out there as a model, right, through Instagram so that other folks can see this and really pick up from that is exceptional, exceptional.
Thank you.
I'd like to bring it over to Karen, who is a professional facilitator of these conversations, and you support white people in addressing racial justice. And probably the bigger job is your mom, right? I would love to hear about what your parents told you about race, and was it accurate, and how does that work into what you're doing today? And what are you telling your children and telling them how they can grow up anti-racist? Karen, I still think you're on mute for a moment.
Here we go. Thank
Excellent.
you. Hi. I'm so excited and honored to be a part of this conversation. And thank you so much, Kenneth and Isu. I'm already learning so much from you. So what my parents taught me about race and racism growing up. Racism is terrible. Dr. Martin Luther King is wonderful. And the way to not be racist is to be colorblind and to treat everybody the same. But because I grew up in a virtually all white community, I never actually saw them do that. They were just telling me that. Then I'm seeing films at school designed to deter us from taking drugs that are basically depictions of Black people overdosing on heroin. As I grow up and I start to grasp, well, why is there so much racial inequality? The story I get back, and my mom swears it wasn't from her, it may have been from the school, I'm not, it was just in the ether, is we used to have terrible racism, but then there was a civil rights movement led by Dr. King, and now everything is equal. And some families like ours work really hard, and that's why we have what we have. And other families choose not to, and that's why they're in the situation that they're in. And I think that's what about 90% of my white friends are telling their kids today, either that or they're not mentioning race to their children at all. And to Issa's point, if you do not frame this issue for your children, they are going to observe things and they're going to make decisions about it on their own. And I knew as a mom, I had the first 8 years of my kids' life to really frame their understanding of the world. And I've been super, super careful about what school they went to, what preschool they went to, what they observed me doing, what books we read, what films we read. And I have to tell you, my proudest times as a mom, when my son was 5, he asked, well, why did we even have slavery? And before I could answer, my daughter, who was 8, gave a better answer than I could. When my son was 7, he asked me, Mommy, which one do we need to end first, racism or sexism? So I can tell you, children love justice. Children hate bullying. Children hate hypocrisy. And, you know, I was adopted, and my parents, from the time I could talk, told me that I was adopted and that it wasn't anything shameful. And it was actually a very important part of my identity and a part of our family history. And I think that if we can take that same approach and talking about race from the time our kids can talk and telling them that it's totally okay. In fact, it's very normal to notice skin color. We all do it. There's nothing shameful about it. What is shameful is that we are a society rooted in slavery, genocide, land theft, and the generation of wealth on the backs of Black people that has gone on for 400 years, and it has to stop. That's what this moment in time is really about, is ending America's terrible legacy of white supremacy. And the place where it stops is in white parents' interactions with our white children.
Thank you so much for that, Karen. We've been hearing about the conversations, and I would like to turn this over to Matt to talk about books and how books can be a tool in these conversations. And I'd love your perspective as an author and a father to a kindergartner. I have a kindergartner too, so it's something we share. I'd love to hear about how books focus on identity, such as yours, can be a tool to empower children through this conversation.
So I love the answers I've been hearing before. And I think one of the words that stands out for me is this idea of humility. As a parent, you have to be humble. We don't have all the answers. So books are an opportunity to talk around the parents. You see what I'm saying? Here's a book. We get to read it, let the kid, lead the conversation. And look what's happening when you read a book to your child. Yes, you're reading the text. You're looking at the pictures. But you're also holding that child in your lap. That's a pretty powerful thing. So I think exposing kids to the right books with powerful examples of representation where, yes, some books are about racism. They're about race. But some books are about a Mexican-American character who's just having a day out on Sunday doing the errands with their brother, right? So there needs to be both books. But the key is there are so many layers to a good story. So when a kid is in kindergarten, they're gonna sort of level into one of those layers because that's what they're capable of. when they're in third grade, they're going to be bringing so much more to that story, and they're going to be able to do more work with it. So I think good children's books have different levels that a child can sort of meet it at. We've all read books at one stage in our life and sort of took it at that, we got out of it what we got at that moment. Then we read it 4 years later and it's almost a different book, right? It's because we are different. So I think as a writer, I have to be humble and know that my book isn't going to be used exactly the way I hoped it would be. It's going to be used the way that family and that child sort of takes the book. So I think humility as a parent, as a father of a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, not easy at this point, but also humility as a creator of art.
Excellent, excellent. The power of the image of having your child with you and reading that book, like I've done it a million times, right? And you never conceptualize that you're sharing this experience, this intimacy on the topic, and being able to bring it across. It's quite exceptional. I'd love to hear from Ebony. We know that these conversations and news, all of this can take a toll, especially on brown and Black children. What coping strategies could you recommend for families to consider?
Okay, so first I'd like to just commend New York City Kids Rise for hosting this event. What an amazing opportunity. And it's a lot of the answers to the questions. What you're doing right now speaks to what we all need to be doing, which is communicating, conversating, and opening up the space for people to hear, learn, and grow. So I want to challenge all of us here on the call today and help us to understand where our locus of control lies. And the power in that locus of control is in the tongue. And uplifting and inspiring our children and challenging them through the obstacles that surround them starts right in our home, regardless of the supremacy, regardless of all the things that are happening outside. I have a 17 and 18-year-old now, and at 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, all I told them was that you can do and be anything you want to do and be in life, regardless of the circumstances. Yes, we need to recognize the racism. It is there. And we need to be completely aware that it is there. But we also need to recognize our locus of control right in our homes. We hold the power to giving our children the gift of wellness in mind, body, and spirit, building strong kids, strong families, and strong communities. And that all starts with, right, thinking through, what do we do? How do we give access to our physical health, our mental health, our emotional health, our spiritual health and well-being, and then circling that back around to our financial health. That power sits right in your circle. We don't have to go grab it outside. It sits right in your home. And so I want to challenge everybody today, including myself, to continue and to maintain and sustain that our power sits right in our tongues. And if we can encourage our children to be the best that they can be, there is no limit to their success. As long as they know that they can find it when they open that door, it will show, and the world will be more powerful because of it. Thanks so much, Murray.
Exceptional. Reminds me of the Bible verse, in the beginning was the Word, right? The power of words and the power of what we have, the responsibility we have as parents. Now that everyone has shared, I wanted to take a moment quickly just to remind all the families and all the observers out on Facebook, YouTube, to please post their comments. We're going to come to them shortly. I just want to do one more round robin with the incredible panelists we have and really talk about what resources we could share with families, whether they're books, whether they're programs, sites, other things that would be of note and really important for our families. So with that, I'll start off with Kenneth again. What would you recommend?
First of all, if I may, it's come to my attention that a former student of mine is present in the discussion, which I am thrilled about, because our youngest learners are never too early to have these conversations. So I'd like to send a big shout out to Ms. Anari. Thank you for joining, friend. I see you. I think some of the resources that have been helpful for me is a book called So You Want to Talk About Race. And in that book, there are different chapters that kind of walk you through some of our most challenging topics in conversations around race. So one of the chapters is about police brutality, and is police brutality actually rooted in race? And it does a wonderful job of kind of unpacking that for us. There's another chapter that talks about the model minority myth and how that impacts Asian identified communities. And another resource that was really, really fantastic is White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. That's a really great book for all folks in terms of what it looks like to be more than an ally, but an accomplice in this work as a white identified individual, but also as folks of color, what it looks like to hold white identified folks accountable in this work.
Excellent. Isu, anything you'd like to recommend?
Yeah, absolutely. Being the son of a librarian, Matt, I am all for the books. And in fact, much of my early identity was formed based on the books that I read, right? So based on Invisible Man, based on Native Son, based on a lot of amazing books that, to be fair, I didn't want to read, but my parents made me read them, right? Um, when I started that conversation with my children about police brutality, they said, "Oh, right." Like when we went to the African American History Museum and we saw the exhibit on Emmett Till, right? So it is taking them to that museum instead of taking them to the arcade sometimes, right? It is putting on that Public Enemy, right? Putting it is, turning the knob on the music and taking them back a little bit in time and making sure that their music education is right and exact, so that they have an excellent point of reference and they're not just totally influenced by all of the music of today. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but we need that diversity of thought. So to me, I think in our family, and I wanted to mention this as well, it really is about um, aligning these conversations with the values and the principles that you have for your family. I think really everybody has kind of alluded to that. In our family, we felt that it was important to have what we call the four pillars, right? Number one, that you had a quality education, and that education was important, and that you were in an environment where it was super cool to be super smart, as opposed to being in an environment where it's not cool to be smart and you feel a need to dumb yourself down. Aside from that, we felt it was important to have an amazing exposure to martial arts, performing arts, and sports. And all of this, there's tremendous life lessons. And all of this, the people that they're going to interact with, your children are going to interact with, absolutely extremely diverse. I read an article in the Washington Post that said 75% of white America has no black friends. Well, we know based on the megatrends that exist today that the millennial generation is the most diverse generation in U.S. history, and that Gen Z is going to be even more diverse than that. We know that that will never be the case in the future. Not only does this generation, somebody said this earlier, not only do they stand for justice, not only do they stand for fairness, they stand for diversity. And so being able to immerse your children in diverse environments is only going to enhance their situational awareness and enhance their identity and enhance their understanding of the world, so that it will be more, as Karen alluded to, man, this is the new normal. Diversity is the new normal, not some ambition that the world wants but believes that it's not really possible. No, it is really possible. All you have to do is turn on the television every night and look at the dynamic that's playing out across the country. It's young people, and it's young people saying, hey, we believe that there should be racial equality. We believe that liberty and justice should be for all, and we believe that our environment should be diverse. And exposing your children to that, but in many different forms, right? Like I said, through the arts, through the books, through the music, through the museums. I get it. They don't always want to do it, but later in life, they're like, I'm so glad my dad made me go to that museum that day, or read that book, or listen to that song.
Excellent. You've given me an experiment for tomorrow. I'm going to throw on some old PE and see if the kids take to it. I mean, they're sooner going to want to listen to some Kendrick, right? But
Stop the violence.
It's both, oh, BDP, you're taking me back to my old hip hop roots, right? So some KRS-One for tomorrow. I'd love to hear from Karen as well. Do you have any resources, programs you'd like to share that you think would be of help for the families?
Sure. So first, I just want to raise white parents' awareness that white supremacists are targeting our children. They are on YouTube. They are on Instagram. They are on all those video game platforms trying to recruit our children. And it starts as like an ad, and then you click on the ad, and then it sucks you down this rabbit hole of YouTube videos where they're actively trying to recruit. So I encourage white parents to monitor your children's social media very carefully and see what kinds of images are popping up on there, and make sure that you are aware of what is going on. Also, I agree 100% with Isu's point. So 43% of millennials are people of color, 47% of Gen Z, and by 2040, this is going to be a majority people of color society. So if you think as a white parent that isolating my kids with other white children and shrouding them in all this privilege is good for them, you are actually harming your child, because by the time your child is at the peak of their career, the society is going to look very different, and they're not going to be able to negotiate it if they have not developed these skills at an early age. As far as resources, for young kids, I really like the Tim and Moby videos on Brain Pop. They do a great job of explaining US history and really difficult subjects in a way that kids can understand and pay attention to. I also really like the TV show The Fosters, does a great job of dramatizing the issues of Gen Z. And Teen Vogue has really good videos made by young people for young people explaining these issues. Two of my favorite books are, this book is Anti-Racist and Stamped Racism, Anti-Racism and You. And this is great for like white parents who are trying to figure this stuff out. To your point, be humble, learn with your kids, read these books together and figure this stuff out together. And to Isu's point about experiences, I've taken my kids to Japanese internment prisons. We have visited Native American massacre sites. We visited in Richmond, Virginia, where enslaved people dug this enormous canal that they had to dig literally by hand through the mud. Like, take your children to visit these places so that they have that experience of what happened here before we were here. And also, no matter what you say to your kids, what they see you do is what they're really going to learn from. So make sure that your kids are seeing you relating across difference as equals, and not just when you're checking out at the grocery store, but in every aspect of your life.
We are their first and probably most powerful example. I completely agree with you. Before I go on to Matt and Ebony with the same questions, just want to remind everyone out there, if you have any questions or anything of that sort or any comments, just please throw them in the Facebook comments. We'll address them with the panelists right after this. So Matt, moving on to you, any resources other than your own books, obviously, that you'd like to share?
So the first thing I would like to say is we are in a global pandemic, as you mentioned earlier. So everything has changed. And what a lot of major educators believe is that the most important thing you could do right now that school's been interrupted, is to read to your children, read with your children, have your children read to you. So there's nothing that you could do that would be more beneficial for their education than just reading. So, I'm the author, but I'm also saying books, read everything. Here's another thing that's very important. It's okay to read the same book over and over and over and over, because a child requests that book over and over because it's almost like, they're getting down to the bone of that story, right? And they're looking for different parts of it every time. So I think that's really important to do. But also reading the world. So somebody mentioned earlier, there's no better way to teach your child than to show them what you do. Kids are reading everything that's happening beyond text, right? So I was a reluctant reader as well, similar to Isu when I was young, but I was reading the world. And I think being aware of that is important. Couple books that I think are particularly important during this time, especially with the protests. I would look for books, this is what I'm doing with my own kids, written by or illustrated by Black authors or illustrators. So a couple that stand out for me. It's a picture book called Saturday by Oge Mora. Just a single mom with her daughter on Saturday, and they're trying to find something fun to do together. Incredibly powerful representation. The Undefeated by Kwame Alexander. Powerful story about African-American experience in America. Each Kindness, I think, is the best picture book I've ever read. It's by Jacqueline Woodson, who was my neighbor in Brooklyn. And then here's another thing that I think is sometimes forgotten about. What about racism within a race? So there's one powerful novel that came out last year. It's called Genesis Begins, about colorism within the Black community. And it's by Alicia Williams. And that's a powerful story to share. And then I just want to end by echoing Isu's point. I went to college, first one in my family to go to college, thanks to a basketball scholarship. And I have to tell you, I learned so much through a sport. Where my dad wasn't around very much when I was growing up, I went to this gym, and those guys that were at the gym, they were my fathers. So I learned so much about people that didn't grow up in my community, my border community, by playing basketball in college and as a young man.
Excellent. I can empathize with the sport notion. I grew up boxing at Elm Court Youth Center in Jackson Heights, and then later on at Gleason's down in Brooklyn. So I can understand how that shapes an experience. Ebony, I'd love to hear from you. Any resources or additional thoughts?
Absolutely. And actually, that was a great segue into the whole wellness thing, Matt. I do believe sports teaches you a whole lot as a kid. It can help you to understand even an opportunity for diversity and getting along with everyone. When you're on a court, everyone has to participate. And regardless of their color, race, ethnicity, it doesn't matter. We all want to win. So we all utilize each other to make that happen. And so I think sports is a dynamic way, which kind of pins back to the whole wellness thing of making sure that your kids understand the holistic piece of the world. So sites like NYC, DOH, they have a lot of activities that are happening right now. Nutrition sites, the Working Families Nutrition Program that's happening right now in NYC. And these are all free programs. You can find a lot on mental wellness under Growing Up NYC. .us/programs, and they'll be posting those in just a second. And then consider this as you think through your financial wealth and health. Visit the NYC Kids Rise site so that you can learn a little bit more about how to save for your children in advance, so that you open up opportunities for them that we may not have had. Like myself, I still struggle with paying loans back, right? So let's give our kids a different way of thinking about things and an opportunity to open that door in a different way. For the adults, I would like to suggest two books. One of them is A Framework for Understanding Poverty by Dr. Ruby Payne. It's an amazing book that really taught me a lot about, working with all people through all types of situations. And then Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. That book is written by Joy DeGruy, an amazing book to learn and understand. I think the ground elements of where people are right now. So I'd like to recommend those two books, and I'd like to wish everybody well through this whole time that we're going through. And once again, know that you hold the power.
Excellent. does not seem like we have many questions in the comments, but I do want to recommend one book of myself, actually, which was a documentary film a couple years ago on PBS, Unforgivable Blackness. As I mentioned, I was a boxer growing up, so Jack Johnson was one of my idols growing up. Not only for his prowess in the ring, but the reality of the fight that he had through his entire life, right? And the notion of me being able to go to college was because so many people fought their way for me to get there, right? And that was the only way that was going to happen for a child of a Colombian immigrant at that time, right? Without the resources. And I want to give a special shout out to Ebony, who was an unpaid spokesman for NYC Kids Rise. But it points to the notion that we as a community come together to reinforce the expectations that we have for our children, right? It can't be Kenneth by himself. It can't be Isu by himself. It can't be Matt. It can't be Karen. It has to be all of us together reinforcing the expectations that we have for our kids from every corner, right? So with that on, I wanted to give the panelists just one more go around. If there's anything else you'd like to say before we close out tonight. And we'll move it around a little bit. We'll start with Isu. How about that?
It's great. I'm learning as much as all of you parents that are listening. I'm learning a whole lot. My pen has not stopped moving the entire time. So thank you everybody for imparting this wisdom. Having that a growth mindset is everything, right? But I wanted to get back to Matt's point, and Ebony, you kind of touched on this as well. I think it's important that we don't pass on our traumas to the next generation. And so I talked before about having the conversation in a way where it was judgment free and it was really more about them than you. We have a lot of traumas that have been passed on from one generation to the next. It's been cyclical, and it's our job to kind of rewire ourselves and make sure that we don't pass that trauma on to the next generation. So I just wanted to make that point. And to the point I was making earlier about art, again, Matt, you talked about the pandemic. Netflix right now has some of the most amazing films and documentaries on this particular subject. I cannot remember a time where there was so much rich content, especially in film, than what's available right now. And Netflix has been just put together an amazing catalog. So we do know that our kids will be in front of that television. So I always tell my kids, use that smartphone to make you smart. And let's use that TV as well for good, not just, to veg. But the last point I wanted to make, and really this is the way that I ended the conversation with my children, is we also, in not passing on that trauma, we have to have the not all conversation, right? That not all cops are bad. Not all white people are racist. I can go on and on about the not all, but just incredibly important to make to frame this conversation in a fair way. And part of having that conversation fairly and not, again, traumatizing our kids with our own baggage is to remind them that this is not all. This is not everybody is this way. And the people that are leading the charge, especially the athletes, because they're the most visible, these are young folks and they're not attached to this baggage, and good for them.
Excellent. That provides a great segue to one of the questions we received in the chat about anxiety and the anxiety these troubling times are having on our kids. I'd love to open it up to the panelists if they would like to opine on that or have something to say.
Yes, this is Ebony. I want to say that anxiety is a real thing. And I wouldn't take a thing like anxiety lightly as if maybe you can just solve that within the home. I would say open up the space and invite a psychologist, a psychiatrist, a counselor, a therapist into your circle. I have posted a free mental wellness service at Growing Up NYC that you might want to tap into, and just ask the question to the expert. If love, your personal love and well-being at home and your uplifting of your child is not enough, then reach out to the expert. That doesn't mean your child is crazy. That doesn't mean, you know, there's a stigma put on your child. That means that you are doing the best to reach out beyond maybe the abilities that you have so that your child is well.
That's excellent.
I was going to chime in. And to piggyback what Isu was saying, children absorb all of what we're doing, specifically our behaviors, right? And so our brains are hardwired, to receive that information, make sense of it. And the research is showing us that as early as a few months after birth, children begin to distinguish between faces based on phenotype rather. And by the age of 5, they've already solidified their bias. Particularly white children are biased towards playing with other white identified children. And so I say that to say that it is incredibly important to be having these conversations early on, and to be honest about the emotional tax that it causes. So to Ebony's point, yes, when that anxiety comes up, speak to it. What was that trigger? Have that open conversation, because we also want to be at a point where our students and our children feel comfortable to come to us with that, right? And to be able to speak to what is triggering in that situation. And then the last thing that I want to say is, particularly for our children of color, it is very, very critical that while we are showing them the Ruby Bridges stories and Martin Luther King, and we're talking about these pioneers, that we're also rooting their identity development in positive images and positive affirmations, right? So we want to make sure we're giving them examples where we're not necessarily perpetuating systems of injustice and stereotyping. So it's important to give a range of what Blackness might look like and so forth.
Excellent. As a follow-up to that, Kenneth, I actually have another question that came into the chat that I think you can start us off on. The search for Black-owned businesses in our community has expanded significantly, primarily in the last few months. How do we develop a sense of a community-mindedness in our kids, right? And how do we develop that and help support that for our kids?
I'm unsure of what that looks like in that sense, but what I can say that is, particularly for the younger learners, it is incredibly important for them to have a sense of community, both in group and out of group, right? And so what does it mean for me to belong in the Black community, right? So for my personal experience, I am biracial and I identify as a Black American. And so what is my experience as a lighter skinned biracial Black male? Right. And so being able to understand all of the things that I bring into the conversation, and then being able to connect that to my community so that way I can have that sense of pride and affinity to having pride within the community.
Excellent. Anyone else would like to opine on the topic?
To touch also on the intergenerational trauma that white Americans have. And I feel that this is a major cause of our white fragility, is that just as Dr. Joy Degree describes the post-traumatic slave syndrome and how it impacts Black Americans contemporarily, white Americans have secondary vicarious intergenerational trauma from having inflicted all of that trauma. And this is the big barrier that prevents us from being able to have honest and open conversations, is our deep-seated fear of being held to account for all of those things that we did. And so one of the resources that I've been pointing people to is Resmaa Menakem, and I posted his website. He's the author of My Grandmother's Hands, which is a somatic therapy approach to healing from intergenerational racialized trauma as Black people, as white people, and also as police. And I think it's a fantastic book. And on his website, he has a free e-course which can also be very good. And as far as like the anxiety, I think we're all experiencing anxiety. And I think being transparent with your kids, you know, this is an unprecedented situation. Nothing like this has ever occurred before. We're all trying to figure it out. And one thing that I have found so inspiring is watching those young Black people with the megaphones leading the revolution on the streets, you know, and their level of courage is so inspiring and makes me feel so confident that we are going to turn and go in the right direction. So watching that with your kids, that it's not just all this negative, horrible stuff, but there are people who are actively engaged in changing the dynamic and making it better. And those are the people who we're looking to, and those are our leaders, and those are the people who we support and get behind, and we are going to go in the right direction. We're not going to wallow in this pit of despair, but we are going to use this as a turning point for progress and real fundamental change.
Hey, Murray, one dimension of this that we haven't talked about, and listen, in some circles it's just considered taboo, but I think we're all learning that we all have to be courageous enough to have the difficult conversations, right? But our kids are going to learn about the political process by and large watching us as well. And so when you go to vote this fall, you know, don't go alone, right? It's incredibly powerful for a child to see their parents vote. And when you are vetting candidates, I think it's incredibly important to let your children in on what your thought process is so that they are learning at a very early age. Right now, everybody is saying that they want to do something to help. Well, one of the biggest things that we can do to help, Ebony was talking about our circle of influence. There's things that we need to do from a political standpoint, instead of saying no to being on jury duty, for example. We need to be on jury duty, because when a district attorney or a prosecutor walks in that courtroom and no one on that jury looks like them or looks like the person that is on the stand, that affects the verdict. These elected officials, the chief of police, the sheriff, etc., city councilman, mayor, these are all elected officials. So while people want to be involved, we should. It doesn't matter how we get involved, doesn't matter how big, how small. We need to get involved, and one of those levels that we need to get involved is we need to get involved politically as well. Don't wait until something happens to you or to someone in your family or to someone in your network before you get mad enough to say, I need to get involved at all levels, not just reading statements from my favorite companies and posting that on social media.
No, that's excellent. I take that same approach to politics and to charity, right, with my kids, right? I try to vet, when I'm vetting a candidate, I'm talking through the issues and stuff like that so that they can see value alignment. The same thing with charity, right? Like, where do you want to give money? Why? How does that align with your values and what you're doing in the world and what you're putting out there? Obviously, charity is you're putting something else out there. Politician, you're putting in a position of power, right? So I can't emphasize that more strongly. We are just about at time. Does anyone have anything else? Well, before that, I actually just wanted to remind the parents that when we're going to close out, we're going to give Matt actually the last word or the last series of words that he wrote in his book. So we'll have a great bedtime story for the kids and really quite a moving story, actually. So it'll be great to have him do that reading. Any last words from our panelists today?
I think it's just super important to take the risk. Be honest with your kids. Tell them you don't have all the answers. Tell them you're trying to figure out. Be candid with your own development, where you are on your personal journey, and just understand that bumps and bruises come with the process. Learning isn't always fun.
I would say love yourself, love your children, and continue to be well. and take that wellness with them throughout the time that they're with you and that you're in their space.
I'll just echo what I said earlier. Have the not all conversation, but also have the conversation about what you all will do to help bring about the change that we all want.
Yeah, I love the quote from Angela Davis. I'm no longer accepting the things I cannot change, so I'm changing the things I cannot accept. And that's what we are doing in this time.
All right. With that, I want to thank all our panelists tonight. I mean, as a parent, not only in District 30, as someone who's trying to navigate these conversations myself with my kids, I'm exceptionally grateful. I got the great joy of being a moderator where I got to learn everything real quick, right? But for the families out there, I really do hope you appreciate this and can take these lessons with you. We are going to post resources after this, all the books and such that the panelists had talked about, all the other resources that are out there. We'll post all those resources on the Facebook page after this. So with that, I want to say thank you to all our panelists, thank you to everyone out there, and remind everyone, we'll give everyone about 30 seconds or so, bring your kids around, and I'd like to turn it over to Matt de la Peña. Thank you so much, Matt.
Thank you. Let me see if I could share screen here. Share screen. Okay. Can you all see the screen now? Does that work? Because I can't see you. Could somebody give me some volume and tell me, do you see the
Yes,
screen?
we can see you.
Awesome. So you just let me know when you want me to start, and I'll start going.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
Matt, they'd like for you to start now.
Okay, sounds great. So for the young people out there, I'm going to read you a book called Last Stop on Market Street. And I think you all know this, but just in case you don't, when you read a picture book, you read the words, of course, but you also read the pictures. So as I read the words to you, read the visual story as well. So this is called Last Stop on Market Street. And it is dedicated to my daughter, Luna. CJ pushed through the church doors, skipped down the steps. The outside air smelled like freedom, but it also smelled like rain, which freckled CJ's shirt and dripped down his nose. He ducked under his Nana's umbrella, saying, "How come we gotta wait for the bus in all this wet?" "Trees get thirsty too," his Nana told him. "Don't you see that big one drinking through a straw?" CJ looked for a long time, but never saw a straw. From the bus stop, he watched water pool on flower petals, watched rain patter against the windshield of a nearby car. His friend Colby climbed in, gave CJ a wave, and drove off with his dad. "Nana, how come we don't got a car?" "Boy, what do we need a car for? We got a bus that breathes fire, and old Mr. Dennis, who always has a trick for you." The bus creaked to a stop in front of them. It sighed and sagged, and the doors swung open. "What's that I see?" Mr. Dennis asked. He pulled a coin from behind CJ's ear, placed it in his palm. Nana laughed her deep laugh and pushed CJ along. They sat right up front. The man across the way was tuning a guitar, An old woman with curlers had butterflies in a jar. Nana gave everyone a great big smile and a good afternoon. She made sure CJ did the same. The bus lurched forward and stopped, lurched forward and stopped. Nana hummed as she knit. How come we always got to go here after church? CJ said. Miguel and Colby never have to go nowhere. Well, I feel sorry for those boys, she told him. They'll never get a chance to meet Bobo or the Sunglass Man. And I hear Trixie got herself a brand new hat. CJ stared out the window, feeling sorry for himself. He watched cars zip by on either side, watched a group of boys hop curbs on bikes. A man climbed aboard with a spotted dog. CJ gave up his seat. How come that man can't see? Boy, what do you know about seeing? His Nana told him. Some people watch the world with their ears. That's a fact. Their noses too, the man said, sniffing at the air. It's a mighty fine perfume you're wearing today, ma'am. Nana squeezed the man's hand and laughed her deep laugh. Two older boys got on next. CJ watched as they moved on by and stood in back. Sure wish I had one of those, he said. Nana set down her knitting. What for? You got the real live thing sitting across from you. Why don't you ask the man if he'll play us a song? CJ didn't have to. The guitar player was already plucking strings and beginning to sing. To feel the magic of music, the blind man whispered, I like to close my eyes. Nana closed hers too. So did CJ and the spotted dog. And in the darkness, the rhythm lifted CJ out of the bus, out of the busy city. He saw sunset colors swirling over crashing waves, saw a family of hawks slicing through the sky, saw the old woman's butterflies dancing free in the light of the moon. CJ's chest grew full, and he was lost in the sound, and the sound gave him the feeling of magic. The song ended, and CJ opened his eyes. Everyone on the bus clapped, even the boys in back. Nana glanced at the coin in CJ's palm. CJ dropped it in the man's hat. Last stop on Market Street, Mr. Dennis called. CJ looked around as he stepped off the bus. Crumbling sidewalks and broken down doors, graffiti-tagged windows and boarded-up stores. He reached for his Nana's hand. How come it's always so dirty over here? She smiled and pointed to the sky. Sometimes when you're surrounded by dirt, CJ, you're a better witness for what's beautiful. CJ saw the perfect rainbow arcing over their soup kitchen. He wondered how his Nana always found beautiful where he never even thought to look. He looked all around them again, at the bus rounding the corner out of sight, and the broken street lamps still lit up bright, and the stray cat shadows moving across the wall. When he spotted their familiar faces in the window, he said, I'm glad we came. He thought his Nana might laugh her deep laugh, but she didn't. She patted him on the head and told him, Me too, CJ. Now come on. And one of the points of this piece is CJ and his grandma are not at the soup kitchen to eat. They're there to serve. And when I was a kid, my mom, she used to tell us, we may not have money to give to people who are struggling even more than we are, but we do have one thing that we can give them, and that's our time. So thank you so much for letting me share that with you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you so much, panelists tonight.
Thank you.
Exceptional, exceptional. And with that, good night, everyone.